Okay, be honest. You've Googled your boss or coworker before, right? Who hasn't? If you've done this, you've likely started creating or building a narrative about that person in your mind or finding out personal info, like pregnancy, accidentally. Now, consider that your boss, your coworkers, and possibly HR are likely doing the exact same thing to you. When it comes to the workplace and social media, there are plenty of landmines. Is it fair to review an employee or job candidate's social media? Is it even legal? What about my rights? Hi, I'm Bianca Lager. I'm the president of Social Intelligence, a consumer reporting agency specialized in social media background checks for employment. As a working professional, you need to be armed with the dynamic ways social media and the workplace intersect. In this course, I'm going to walk you through the social media landscape, what you should be mindful of when it comes to your employer seeing what you post, and how you can monitor your data privacy rights. As social media continues to play a crucial role in our lives, and as employers increasingly place value on mitigating the risk of online harassment, of bullying, and of viral bad publicity, I want to arm you with the mindfulness and business smart savvy that you need in building a successful career. So let's get started. Who remembers MySpace Tom? He was a lot of our very first social media friend. He was the one on MySpace that was in that top left corner to remind you that, hey, you were connected to someone. The very early days of social media was an exciting time. For a lot of us, our very first interactions online with each other were on chat or the very first platforms that came to be. I want to share with you a little bit about the history and some statistics so you can put into context where we are today with social media, where we came from. And it helps us understand the intentions people have and why we really use social media, and it's such a prolific part of our lives today. First, let's think about the very beginning of online connections. The birth is probably actually even earlier than you think. In 1997, a company called 6 Degrees created a platform where you could make a profile and make friends. Something we're familiar with a lot today, but in 1997, it was certainly a brand new thing. Shortly after that, AOL IM, many of us knew and loved it when we were younger. Those were the things that folks started using when we started interacting online. We use a lot of those very same approaches and connections in a very similar way today. We make friends and communicate. As the world of social media evolved in 2002, 2004, LinkedIn, MySpace, and Facebook were born. Now, some of these things are platforms that you probably still use every day. And all social networking, they all started being created for different purposes. They focused on different things: career, entertainment, music, and college communities. As these social network platforms branched out, they improved networking features. They started allowing picture sharing, videos, all sorts of different mechanisms to gain broader audiences. Facebook and LinkedIn obviously very successfully grew those audience sizes to a degree that is now staggering. And they're just an example of some of the places where people live today. To put it into context, almost 4 billion people use social media worldwide. 81% of U.S. adults between the ages of 18 and 49 use YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram every single day. YouTube is one of the top platforms. Viewers watch over 1 billion hours of videos on its platform every single day. They're responsible for generating billions and billions of views. And now more emerging platforms come up all the time, things like TikTok, and more niche places of the internet, places where smaller communities gather and have smaller amount of users, but they focus generally on the same exact things: sharing information and connecting folks together. What are some of your favorite social media platforms? What do you do when you log in? Is your usage tied to your job in any way? By noticing your own behaviors and understanding the part you play on social media, you can become aware of how your social media presence may impact your job and your career strategy. Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, 8chan, Parler. There are so many places on the internet. Dating sites, music sites. There's so much interaction that we have and social interaction ingrained into multiple platforms. Social media is one thing, but social networking, it's integrated in a whole wide variety of everyday internet tools. All these places and contact types, well, they can expose problematic content. It's not just about what you post on Facebook or LinkedIn. There are areas of the internet where folks are interacting that seemingly seem innocuous, but they actually present opportunities for threatening, bullying, or really dangerous behavior. Social networking is ingrained now in all of these sites, and it's really just become an everyday part of our life. You can leave a footprint basically anywhere. Your employer is likely interested in looking deeper than just a glance at Facebook or LinkedIn. Where else are you? Where are you communicating with folks, and how do you go about that? It's not just the LinkedIn and the Instagrams or whatever of the world. These niche sites, places where you talk to folks and you have the opportunity to have a public profile, well, they can have a small quantity of users, but really high quality of information and demonstrations of where folks might be interacting in a way that's not positively impacting the community. There is an infinite amount of places where you can show up online. You can be sharing jokes, you can be talking to communities and groups. It's really far and wide these days. It's tough to keep track of, and it's really not something that you can just wrap your head around in a quick glance. I suggest you make a list of which sites you use regularly. Where are the places where you're sharing content, whether it's your own or you're pushing other people's forwards? Where are the public places where you discuss things, news articles, dating sites, your music list, your Amazon wish list? Review the content that you're interacting with and how you're sharing it in a public way with other people. It's really the first step in doing an audit of what might matter to an employer if they were to find you online as well, and what your public footprint looks like for really anybody. Social media can be so toxic. Why is that? Why sometimes when you're scrolling through the internet, do you see folks getting so angry, so upset, so mean to each other sometimes? Social media is a super dynamic and ever-changing and emotional place. This is a place where people come to vent. People come to express how they feel about really anything and everything. About 1 in 10 people post something potentially adverse, meaning potentially a post that would affect your employment. In my experience, what I've seen is that those posts range from anything that is fairly harmless to really dangerous stuff. There are so many places on the internet where that can happen. The niche corners of the internet that have super small communities, or the large platforms. They have ever-changing settings and privacy changes that make content available, not available, public, not public. There's really popular places online where it's easy to find this stuff, and really not so popular places that it might make it harder, but nonetheless, they're available out there, and it's an ever-changing world that you have to keep up with in terms of who's going to see it and at what level of risk are you exposing yourself. Some of the biggest problematic content, of course, platforms deal with this, and employers are certainly concerned about hate speech and violence. These are the really true emotional outbursts. Sometimes they're politically divisive. Sometimes they're just driven by circumstances in somebody's personal life that's happening. But essentially, these are the extreme examples of when people have really, really high emotion be let out online. And of course, other people are interacting with it. The amount of exposure on the variety of platforms and their ever-changing dynamics make it all heightened and make it seem very loud. Listen, we have all been guilty of emotional social media overreactions. Before you post something, ask yourself if you're emotionally reacting. And if so, write it down somewhere else first. Speak it out loud. Think about what your reasons are for posting it. Is it something that really needs to be said, or is this something that you think will make you feel better? Is it something offensive and is going to be divisive? Are you maybe doing that on purpose because you want to get a rise out of folks? It's really important to start thinking about how emotional opinions and interactions happen online so you can have a bit of patience with others and what they're going through, and also do an audit of your own emotional social media outbursts so that you can understand and have a better mindful approach to how you're dealing with your social media content. It started online and ended up in the workplace, or it started in the workplace and ended up online. A client said this to me once, and it resonated so well. I just thought that was a really brilliant way to sum it up. The way that employers have to deal with online data and online issues these days is prolific. It is something that they have to research if there's a harassment issue, or something that they have to mitigate if there's some sort of event that takes place and the communication was primarily online. Employers face several external and internal pressures that require them to consider their employees' social media presence. So what are some of those issues? Where do they come from? Well, first, let's talk about bullying and harassment. This is something that companies as a concept have been dealing with for a super long time. We don't want folks bullying each other in the workplace. Harassment in all types and forms is not okay. How that's translating to online data and online communication is really loud. It's something that can happen very easily and something that can really blow up an internal, otherwise productive team and make that team not be productive anymore and may even cause harm to an employee. Another thing that they consider, of course, is safety. We want to keep folks safe. Your employer and your boss is not in the business of putting you in danger. It's very much in the business of making sure both employees and their customers feel physically and emotionally safe. The types of harassment or difficulties that can happen, and even violence, are not just, of course, terrible things to happen to folks, but they can create legal liabilities and a lot of risk for employers. And mitigating that stuff up front is just something they absolutely have to deal with. The last thing that's a pretty big deal for your employer is public relations, the PR of it all, the viralness of it all. When a post goes viral and it indicates something that is potentially dangerous for the workplace, well, that's really problematic. A lot of folks are looking at the people that they are customers of, the companies that they trust, Googling employees and saying, "You hired that guy?" It's a really big problem, and they get a lot of pushback for it. So all of these factors lead to a place where your employer is faced with saying, "Hey, we need to do something about this. We need to look at this stuff. We need to do it in a fair and compliant way, but these are problems that we just can't ignore." I want you to reflect on experiences that you've been a part of, or viral news stories that you've seen that had something to do with online communication or social media posts. I bet you can think of one or two examples really easily. These are the things that are happening every day, and these are the things that your employer has to face. They have a stake in understanding and mitigating risk for employment-related purposes. When you are interacting on social media, or if you are involved with something in your workplace that has an online communication or social media issue around it, consider your employer's perspective and consider the ways that they're really thinking about how to keep the workplace safe and productive and a healthy place for everyone to work in. Look, no one really cares if you are posting pictures of yourself online at too many parties on the weekends, or pictures of your food, or pictures of your dog. That kind of innocuous, fun stuff is what social media is all about and what it's for. Your employer is really concerned about the stuff that affects the workplace, specifically in a negative fashion. So, regardless of platform, regardless of the content type that you're sharing, there are generally three top behavioral trends online that unarguably affect the workplace negatively. The first one to think about is intolerance. Now, this is a really broad and really complicated topic. Defining hate speech. What is hate speech? How do you really think about when it's hate speech, when you're affiliated with hate speech, and when it's not? What I suggest to do if you're curious about what intolerance might mean to your company is to think about how credible sources like the Anti-Defamation League or the FBI actually define this stuff, especially for groups that you might see online. It's such a broad topic, and there's such a category of information in there that people can get involved with without even really understanding it. Having an understanding of what intolerance really means and how it impacts the workplace is really important so that you can appreciate certain policies or perspective that your employer might have of why they really can't tolerate the intolerance. The next category is illegal activity, especially drug use and violence. These are pretty much no-brainers, right? And we talk about this. This is the kind of stuff that employers just really might have a problem with in terms of social media posts. It's a bad look. It's actually breaking the law. There are several things that on there that can create potential workplace problems. And it's simply the stuff where employers are drawing the line. Another really big category of information is sexually explicit content. Now, this is stuff that is questionable, right? Do beach photos count? Can I take a picture of myself in my bikini? Well, it might depend on your employer. But for the most part, my experience has shown that folks are really, concerned with sexual content that is explicit in nature, that is more than just suggestive in nature, that actually has to do with acts that are really inappropriately being shown online and can create, problems for the workplace in terms of sexual harassment and in terms of just what their policies and code of conduct are. So now that you know, some of the top 3 behaviors that employers see online all the time that create risk for them, that they're concerned about, take notice of those behaviors. Are you posting them yourself? Do you have folks in your network that is posting stuff like that? Think about it from your employer's perspective. What if you Googled this person and found it? What kind of issues do you think it would create in the workplace? If this was the person that you shared a cubicle with, how comfortable would you be going into work the next day? Thinking about these things from that perspective really helps you understand the areas of liability that your employer is facing and can really help you appreciate the effort to keep your workplace productive and safe and to keep everybody healthy and happy as possible. Diversity, inclusion, and equity. They are initiatives that are incredibly important, if not a vital part, of how companies operate and thrive. These days, these are the backbone of how companies represent themselves and describe and uphold their values both internally and externally. Social media reviews and background screenings that include online information are becoming a growing part of those initiatives. Let me tell you a little bit about why and why it matters. Folks that are involved with or leaders of DE&I initiatives within their companies, well, they can show measurable value in supporting safer and more inclusive workplaces with proactive social media screenings. These generally are formal screenings that have boundaries around legal parameters, when you can do them, and what you're seeing. But these are ways and places that DE&I leaders can really get involved and not only call balls and strikes, but help, again, support those initiatives and those values that they lay out and hold so dear. Leaders can also help create and enforce boundaries and policy around the intersection of offline and online life, especially when it comes to the workplace. Where are the areas where, as a company, we're going to consider, online communication or social media posts? Where is it that it matters? Especially places in like intolerance areas or places where it's really affecting the value and potentially harassment or problematic interactions online. This is where DE&I leaders can really step in and say, hey, this is what's okay, this is what's not, and this is our policy around it. Lastly, social media screenings provide teachable moments for offensive behavior. So, especially when it comes to social media, folks sometimes post stuff without really thinking about it. They're not very mindful sometimes. They're not necessarily trying to offend anybody. However, this is stuff where at the workplace, it's not going to be okay. It might cause a problem. So what I've seen is DE&I leaders getting involved in these interactions to talk to the person who posted it and to say, hey, did you know that this is offensive? Did you know this was violating our policy? Could you take it down? Talk to me about what you posted. Tell me about what you're thinking about this, and let me give you the perspective maybe of somebody else who might be offended by it. These are really good moments for the individual who posted it. They don't need to necessarily be punished or judged because of that, but sometimes it just simply needs to be pointed out so that they understand what the policy is of the company and how it does affect the workplace. I think it's an incredibly important opportunity for employers to clarify some of those initiatives for folks and see how they actually play out in the day-to-day practical work environment. So, does your employer discuss their DE&I initiatives openly? I suggest seeking somebody out that is involved in these initiatives, or potentially someone from HR that can help clarify if these initiatives are being discussed. And more importantly, how it applies to your online content or anybody's online content at your work. Is there policy around this stuff? Are there boundaries? And have they really had to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and the intersection of online communication and social media posts? The more informed you are, the better involved that you can become in your own company's initiatives and help yourself be mindful and consider what kind of posts would affect these policies so that you can keep your career and your work efforts in the best light possible. You may have asked yourself, is my boss looking at my social media? Are my coworkers? Is someone in HR poking around on my online profiles? The answer is probably. As a matter of fact, it's really easy. It's at our fingertips all day long. We can just yank up somebody's profile, take a look, and scroll through their photos and see what they're all about. So why do each of these people want to check out your social media profile? Well, they each have a different perspective. Your boss, well, this is the person that's probably pulling up your profile because they are curious about who you are. Should I trust this person? Will they fit in? But this has serious problems. Your boss simply pulls up one of your popular social media platform pages. They can create bias. They also can do this inconsistently. Did they look at that person's Facebook profile, but not this person's? What is the point? What are they really trying to ascertain? As good as their intentions sometimes are, your boss simply pulling up your profile can create issues for you personally or for your team dynamic. Your coworkers, it's really similar to your boss. What they're trying to do is see if you guys are going to get along, who this person is all about. However, each one of these people, when they're pulling up these profiles, can create narratives about you that may or may not be true. The one place where it's fairly likely to have a formalized look at social media is HR. It's also likely the best place for an online review. Like other background checks, these folks can create legally sound workflows and procedures that minimize a violation of your privacy rights, yet address the policy violations and needs of the organization. Your privacy is incredibly important. And for the most part, folks at your job aren't really trying to get you into trouble or create a problem that is unnecessary. They're not trying to create trouble for you. They're trying to see if they can trust you. However, your data and your privacy, it's important. It's important that these things are done correctly and accurately. Ask HR if they do any social media screenings, either before or after hire. It's important for you to ask these questions as part of an organization you're already in or are considering so that you understand what those policies and procedures are for each one of those stakeholders who might be curious about what's on your social media profile. Freedom of speech. In many countries, and certainly the US, freedom of speech is an important pillar of democracy. It's part of our ethical foundation and the way we think about fairness. But that's not all. When it comes to social media, freedom of speech is just one little part of it. I really want to take a look at the laws affecting how and when employers can review your social media. First and foremost, think about wherever jurisdiction that you are, whatever country that you live in, the federal or national laws that might affect data and privacy. In the US, there are things like the EEOC that consider protected class information. There is something called the FCRA that regulates how consumer reporting agencies are involved with different types of background checks. Social media is certainly included in that. When you're sharing information online, not only should there be guidelines around what kind of information an employer can access and take a look at, but what they can also use in an employment decision. That's what those laws essentially help outline. The next place to think about are local jurisdictions. So this might be states, provinces, cities. There's a variety of law differences between many places that change drastically and that affect background checks in general. Not only background checks, but social media privacy. There are 26 states in the United States, for example, that have social media privacy laws in terms of how your employer can or cannot directly access your social media. Taking a look at some of these laws and understanding what your rights are is very important. Another thing to really consider is data privacy. So in Europe, there are a set of laws that is regulated by something called the GDPR. In California, there is something recent called the CCPA. These are about privacy, data privacy. When is your data accessed? How is data on these social media platforms shared, sold, given to others? These are the types of laws that protect from a variety of data breaches. So it could be anything from email addresses to the actual content that you're putting online. Doing a quick internet search about national and local laws that might affect you is a really good idea. Better yet, of course, talk to a lawyer if you can. Understand from a legal perspective what some of these laws are, depending on where you live, and how it might affect your relationship with your employer. And of course, feel free to ask questions to your employer to see if they've really dabbled or set up any formalized process for social media screenings and how they address these laws specifically. At this point, I think I might have heard it all in terms of mistaken identity online. Oh, my accounts are private. Oh, I use a fake name. Oh, I was hacked. That really wasn't me. People say all sorts of things around this or dismiss the concept of it entirely. And if you're one of these folks, you're not alone. It's completely easy to sort of think, well, either it's just not that big of a deal, or to be on the other side of the spectrum and think everyone's out to get you and you're getting hacked and it's happening all the time. I think most of these extreme views come from a little bit of a fear of understanding who's in control of your data, and how much control you really have when it comes to what you post online. I'm here to tell you, you are actually in the most control. Should a mistake happen, you have a path for correction. There are things that you can do to avoid these kinds of mistakes or issues with hacking, for example. And there's also things and mechanisms that you can approach so where you can correct it. So let's put it into perspective. Most people have about 3 to 5 publicly available, identifiable online profiles. These profiles usually have a hodgepodge of privacy. So, for example, Twitter is on and off. You either see everybody's Twitter tweets or you don't. Facebook, every single piece of content that you create, you make a decision whether or not that should be public or private and which audience members can take a look at it. So if you go to somebody's online profile or Facebook profile, you'll generally find a variety of content that is or is not available to you depending on your connection or relationship with them. It's complicated. And again, on every single one of these profiles, it's different. The next thing that I want to talk about is the concept of being completely private. So actually, only about 1 in 150 people or so have absolutely zero or very limited online footprint that is hard to identify. So are you sure you're private? Your middle name, nickname, etc. It's actually pretty easily decipherable. So you might not be hiding yourself as best as possible or as well as you think you are. The last thing to think about when it comes to identity or making mistaken identity online is what you do when a mistakes happen. Well, in terms of a formal social media check that your employer may be running on you, there is a dispute resolution process, and you should be able to access what that dispute resolution process is. Regardless of what the outcome is, if there is something that is fundamentally untrue, there are mechanisms and ways that you can address that and folks that you can talk to so that it can be corrected. Anybody who's involved with a formal social media screening has a duty to correct these things and make them as accurate as possible. In addition, of course, you can always go to the platforms themselves. They deal with complaints and things like this all the time, but it's pretty quickly and easily resolved and very easy to identify when a hack or when some sort of data breach has happened. Highly encourage you to explore these mechanisms should anything come up where you feel there has been a data breach or something that's been unsafe. I would say that in general, whenever we're talking about mistaken identity online or trying to be private, you can do your best to hide your footprint. But the better advice, whatever you're doing online, be respectful and be kind. If you're not creating problematic content, then there isn't a whole lot of reason that you need to hide it or go out of your way to protect yourself. Now, there's a lot of reasons that you might want to limit the audience that takes a look at your content, and that's totally fair. Be mindful of what those privacy settings are and be aware of the mechanisms that you can approach should you think that there's an error or something that needs to be corrected. Let me ask you a couple questions. Does your company have a social media policy? Do you even know where to locate it or who even to ask if there is one? If you don't know the answers to these questions, seek it out. I want to share with you the why, the who, the what, and the how of a social media policy. So let's think about the why. If you never even heard of a social media policy, well, there's reasons that companies create one. The policy is necessary for compliance, legal, ethical, and truly operationally efficient purposes. What's fair for everyone? What are the ground rules? And what are the expectations? A social media policy is intended to create an outline so that everybody knows what's expected of them and what's off limits in terms of social media posting. Now, let's think about the who. Who's involved with creating the social media policy, and who should you talk to if you have questions about it? Well, generally HR or someone in a senior leadership position. They're usually the ones that are involved with crafting this, okaying it, making sure that it's approved and represents the proper values of the company. You can also just ask your boss. If they don't know, they should have a mechanism to find out who at the company does know about it. Let's think about the what. So what is a social media policy? Well, in general, it's simple rules that are general or specific to your industry. No violence, no drugs, those can be examples of general kind of ideas that most companies add in their social media policy. It could be something as specific as no sharing client, patient data, student data, depending on who you work with, who the stakeholders and who the customers essentially are of your business. It can be very specific into how you interact with those folks or how you represent the products that your company wants to represent publicly. Now, let's think about how. So, if you're someone who's involved with actually creating or maintaining a social media policy, certainly the first step is to talk to a lawyer. You can also lean on social media screening experts or actually your background screening expert for help. It's actually not as hard as it sounds to develop this as a new policy. Usually it's a couple bullet points that is added to an already existing code of conduct policy. So as an employee in an organization, it's important that you ask your boss or HR. Understand what your company's social media policy is all about and know the ground rules. Culture fit is such a buzz phrase. It can mean a wide variety of things, and it can often confuse folks as to what is or is not a culture fit. It can also be a bit of a dangerous trap for folks that don't quite fit into the norm or the clique of certain popular types of activities within an organization. Culture fit is a really important part of what shapes the intentions behind your employer's interest in your social media profiles. So, to understand how your social media activity aligns or misaligns with your organization, look no further than your company values and the culture norms. First thing to think about, company values are not just buzzy trends necessarily for PR purposes. They really, really matter. Values are what your company believes in and stands for. They impact your company's organizational efficiency, and they can make or break an employee experience. After reviewing your company's social media policy, or lack thereof, consider the deeper meaning and how the policy reflects or helps define the values of your organization. Did they take a stance on racism? Is violence in the workplace addressed? How did they address behaviors that can positively impact an organization? And how do they address behaviors that can create a toxic workplace? Cultural norms, especially negative ones, can sometimes bleed to online activity. So if there's an organization that is prolific with bullying or sexual harassment, or even has these kind of instances happening under the radar, these kind of behaviors can translate online really easily. It's really important for you to take a step back, identify the behaviors and cultural norms at your organization, and understand how some of those toxic ones can bleed online and potentially put yourself in a position to be somebody who represents the positive cultural norms and encourage the best out of your coworkers and the workforce around you. So how does your company's values align with your own? Does your social media activity align or misalign with those values? You don't necessarily have to be somebody who's cheerleading your company's values all the time and never steps out of line. You certainly are entitled to your own opinions, but the deeper meaning behind what your company values are in terms of keeping folks safe, being kind and respectful, and keeping your conduct professional is something that is going to be important and impactful to not only your current job, but your career as a whole. If you didn't know formal social media background screenings are a thing, let me tell you, they certainly are. It's an area that is rapidly growing, and before you know it, it'll just be part of the employment process. So I want to share with you how formal social media screenings work and why it's the ethical outcome that truly works for everyone. So the first thing to know is that formal social media screenings are the same as any other background check. There are legal ground rules that make it fair and transparent for everyone. And for the most part, companies are most concerned with egregious disruptive content. So these are things that create toxicity or violate policy. Political opinions and certainly protected class information, like pregnancy, that info is off limits. And with formal screenings, there are mechanisms that make sure that's not a part of the equation. So as an employee, you should inform yourself as to what your organization's process is. Find out who the provider is and ask questions. Who looks at the reports? What does the report look for? How is protected class info protected? Lastly, know that formal screenings include a dispute resolution process. If you think something is unfair, you are entitled to get in touch with the consumer reporting agency who ran the report and HR, have them identify and correct the error. As formal social media screenings rise in workplace settings, seek out info. Inform yourself on your legal rights and feel confident that with the transparency and well-communicated ground rules, your workplace is on the right track for a safer, more productive environment. Congratulations! You've made it to the end of the course. You're now a savvy and informed working professional and social media user. My hope for you is that you have a high-level appreciation of the concerns, values, and real workplace toxicity that employers, possibly your employer, has to deal with. You can now apply this knowledge to be more mindful of not only what you post online, but how policy and decision-making in this arena is formed to help support healthy, productive workplaces. I know that you want to be a positive contributor to that goal. So congrats on taking the first step needed in learning about how we all can work towards ethical solutions in the highly emotional, highly charged world of social media and the workplace. Feel free to send me your questions anytime by connecting with me on one of those social media platforms. LinkedIn or Twitter is usually best. If you're looking for more info, follow @SocialIntel on any platform or visit the blog at socialintel.com. Also, reach out to your HR team or background screening provider for more info on how they handle online screenings. See you online, and please don't forget, be kind.